Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about the Ikhernofret Stela from ancient Egypt. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with this term, a stele was a sort of large inscribed stone describing an important event, usually a significant battle won by a king. But the Ikhernofret Stela is really unique and important because instead of that, it describes a significant religious ritual in ancient Egypt. And actually, some have argued that this stele describes this stele is the earliest surviving description of a piece of theater, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. So, according to the introduction in the Penguin Classics collection, Writings from Ancient Egypt, Ikhernofret was a member of the royal court under the 12th dynasty king Senusret III. That's right, the Senusret III. No, except Egyptologist. He ruled circa 1836 to 1818 BCE. So, Senusret III, so the stela itself is not super long. I mean, again, this was carved on a stone block in hieroglyphics, and it was then later translated. So the first portion of the text talks about basically like honors Senusret III, honors some Egyptian gods, Horus, Ra, etc., etc. The second portion of the stele talks about how Senusret III chose Ikhernofret specifically to administer this religious ritual. How, like, Senusret sent Ikhernofret forth to do this task because he was the only person that could do it successfully, and all this stuff. And so we've got the charge to carry out this religious ritual. Then we have a description of the ritual itself, and this is what's really unique about the Ikhernofret Stela. We have a fairly detailed explanation of what happened. So I'm going to read you the whole description, and then we'll talk a little bit more about this. So it says here, I did exactly as His Majesty decreed in carrying out what my lord commanded for his father Osiris, foremost of the Westerners, Lord of Abydos, great power in Tower Province. I acted as his beloved son for Osiris, foremost of most of the Westerners. I embellished his great bark, eternal and everlasting. I made for him the carrying shrine that exalts the beauty of foremost of the Westerners in gold, silver, lapis lazuli, bronze, boxwood, and cedar. The gods in his retinue were fashioned and their shrines made anew. I made the priests on duty diligent at their tasks. I made them observe the daily rituals and the seasonal festivals. I directed work on the Neshmet bark, and I fashioned the cabin. I adorned the breast of the Lord of Abydos with lapis lazuli and turquoise, electrum, and every precious stone as ornaments of the god's body. I clothed the god in his regalia in my capacity as master of the secrets, my duty as stolist. Stolist was the person who dressed the gods. Because in ancient Egypt, one of the things that the priests did in the temples, was they would dress the gods anew every day. They would bring them offerings of food, they would dress them, bathe them. So they treated the statues of the gods as though they were the actual gods themselves. And the Egyptians believed that they were. So the stolist was the person, the priest charged with dressing the god. My hands were pure when adorning the god. I was a ritual priest with respectful fingers. I masterminded the procession of Wepwawet, when he goes forth to protect his father. I repulsed the attackers of the Neshmet bark and slew the enemies of Osiris. I also masterminded the great procession that follows in the god's footsteps. I enacted the sailing of the god's bark with Tot as steersman. I furnished the boat Risen in truth is the Lord of Abydos, with a cabin. Wearing his beautiful regalia, Osiris proceeded to the divinity of Peker. I cleared the god's path to his tomb in front of Peker. I protected Wennefer on the day of the great battle. I slew all his enemies on the shore of the Ned. I caused him to go inside the great bark. It exalted his beauty. I made the eastern deserts joyful and created rejoicing in the western deserts when they saw the beauty of the Neshmet bark as it landed at Abydos and brought Osiris, foremost of the westerners, lord of Abydos, to his palace. I followed the god to his house. His purification was made, his throne was laid out. I loosened the knots inside I'm missing a little bit of the text here, and he came to rest among his followers. So we have here a description of the entire sequence of this ritual, which is really, really exciting because it tells us a lot about ancient Egyptian religious activities. So we start with a description of the statue of Osiris, which again, for the Egyptians was Osiris himself, being bathed, being dressed, being adorned in jewelry and rare stones, gold, lapis lazuli, things like this. We have the construction of ritual objects, a boat, given the name Risen in Truth is the Lord of Abydos. So this is a boat specifically sort of christened for this occasion. We have the reenactment of a battle, and this is where people have made the argument that this is the earliest description of a piece of theater, because we have what we might in theater terms what we would call costumes, sets, props, things like this. But when he says, I masterminded the procession of Wepwawet when he goes forth to protect his father, I repulsed the attackers of the Neshmet bark and slew the enemies of Osiris. This idea in particular, some people have said, that's theater. This is a performance. This is a reenactment of one of the myths of Osiris. Is this theater? No, not really, in my opinion. And obviously my opinion is not shared by everyone on this. There are those who would say this qualifies as theater. For me, this is a performative ritual. This is a ritual grounded in the reenactment of a particular set of mythic events. And that, to me, does not qualify as theater. And the reason is that this performance works only in the context of this religious ritual. This is not something that you could do outside this ritual. It's simply inconceivable that this would be performed apart from the particular ritual that Ikhernofret's describing here. Whereas theater, for me at least, it starts probably as a ritual. So this is the argument, right, of the Cambridge ritualists about the origins of Greek theater. The argument is that they started as rituals, particularly what were called goat songs, or choral performances to the god Dionysus. And then they become more elaborate, they become more developed, and we get Greek tragedy and comedy as we come to know it. So that's probably true. I think that's the general consensus now about how Greek tragedy comes to exist. But very quickly with Greek tragedy, you start to have these performances done apart from religious rituals. So in the 5th century, especially the early portion of the 5th century BCE, Greek tragedy was largely performed at the city Dionysia or the Linnaea, which were the two main theatrical festivals in Athens. But very quickly, I think by like the middle of the 5th century, certainly the later portion of the 5th century, you start to have Greek drama performed outside of the ritual context. Plays start to be put on for their own sake because people enjoy watching them. And so in that sense, you have theater that can stand alone without a religious, ritualistic context. In the Ikhernofret Stela, that's not what we have. What we have here is a performance that requires the structure of a religious ritual, requires the priest, requires the statue of Osiris, which again is for the Egyptian the god himself. And so for me, this is not theater, this is ritualized religious performance, which is itself a really important predecessor and sort of fellow traveler genre to theater, but it's not quite the same thing. Nonetheless, the Ikhernofret Stela, it's incredibly important for what it tells us about religion in ancient Egypt, what it tells us about how the gods were treated, the role of priests, the interconnection between religion and the pharaoh, the religious authority, and what we might call the secular authority, although the Egyptians would not have divided it up that way. So the Ikhernofret Stela tells us a massive amount. It's really, really significant because it shines a light on something that we simply don't get that many clear descriptions of.